But if you're listening to this and you're a pastor that says, I see the numbers, I sort of see the writing on the wall, and I want to lead into the future by pursuing this path, that's not a failure in my view, that's a hero.
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry. My guest in this episode is Eric Hoke. He's known as the I Help Pastors Get Jobs guy, and we'll be talking about how to build long-term sustainable ministry, reduce financial stress, and create value in the marketplace by becoming an intentionally covocational pastor. Eric and I talk about the content of his new book, Market Street Pastor, Ministry Sustainability Without Money Stress. We do so that we can address many of the issues involved in making the shift toward covocational ministry, including the mindset shift most pastors must take to start down this road, the value that pastors bring to the marketplace, how to find your marketable skills through using the heart, head, hands, and feet method, how to get through the clutter of thousands of job applicants, how to present yourself and your skills in a job interview, and so much more. And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with my quick take on the mindset shift that needs to happen in both the pastor and the congregation when we start taking covocationality more seriously. Well, Eric, welcome to the Church Lobby. It's good to have you with us today.
It's great to be here, Karl. Thanks for the invitation.
So you call yourself the I Help Pastors Get Jobs guy, and I think it's probably been about a year or so since I found you online, probably on X, formerly Twitter. I don't know how long we're going to keep saying formerly Twitter after we say X, but we still are now. And what caught me immediately was, okay, here's a guy who figured out what he did, what he does, and he has said it in the clearest, most straightforward way possible. What does Eric Hoke do? It's pretty obvious. He's the I Help Pastors Get Jobs guy. So how did you become the I Help Pastors Get Jobs guy? Let's start there.
Sure. So I am a former accidental covocational church planter. I planted a church in the South Bronx of New York City. And I say accidental because I planted in a historically underserved community. I recognized pretty quickly the tithes and offerings of the congregation were not going to sustain my life in the most expensive city in America. So I thought, well, let me just kind of do this whole bivo covo thing that I hear about from others. I was full-time prior to that. And then once, everybody gets in touch with my dynamic preaching and world-class leadership and the church balloons up to a massive size, then I'll quit that day job and just focus on the church and quote unquote be a real pastor again. Well, 7 years and one pandemic later, our church never got to the size of being able to support a full-time pastor. But through all of that, I actually found a rhythm that worked really well for myself, my congregation, and my family, which was having a traditional kind of 8 to 5 job in Manhattan while also planting All Saints Church in the Bronx. And I had a mentor of mine reach out and say, Eric, like your day job is helping people get jobs. I work in workforce development, corporate training. You've been a pastor and church planter for a number of years. What if you melded those worlds and helped pastors who want to explore kind of Covo, Bivo, how to kind of rebrand their ministry skills for the marketplace? And I kind of blew it off because I'm like, that doesn't sound like something I want to pursue. Make a long story short, my friend was right. I was wrong. A lot of pastors were really interested in that. They were kind of feeling the same things I was feeling in the Bronx of like, I love the Lord. I love ministry. I want to keep doing ministry here, but just is not paying the bills. So I need to find another way to supplement my income. So that's how I kind of became the I Help Pastors Get Jobs guy. $13 Google site that was very ugly. We updated since then, thank God. And a lead generating PDF and a couple of tweets on X and Facebook posts later. And 3 years, March will be 3 years since we've launched. So it's been pretty cool.
Yeah, I love that story because it makes sense for what you do. The story of what you did is the story you're now laying out for others to follow in a whole lot of ways. Up until really very recently, the last 3 to 5 years at the most that I've noticed, a pastor working an outside job was something that you did until you could do full time. But in recent years, that has begun to shift, including using a different terminology for it. So
Mhm.
for most of my life, way back in the day when I was younger, we called it tent making,
Tent
from
making.
the
Yep.
Apostle Paul, tent making. Then we came up with a term bivocational. And now we've got the term covocational, which is distinct from bivocational. And you're really talking covo, not bivo. So explain to us the difference between those two terms.
Yeah, I have to give credit where credit is due. I think Brad Briscoe was the first person to put those two together, and I think it is a good distinction. So the way I have to explain it is bivocational is a pastor who says, yeah, I'm going to work a job once the church is at a size where it can pay me a salary. I'm going to quit that job so I can focus fully on the congregation, fully on the church. So sort of like a short-term strategy, 6 months, 2 years, however long it takes. Co-vocational is a person who says, I not only feel called to pastor this church, I also feel called to the marketplace. And even if my church could afford to pay me full time, I'm still going to keep a foot in the marketplace because I feel like that's just as much of my ministry as being a pastor of a local church is.
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it for people. And for those who are listening, if you haven't heard the term before, the term is less important than the concept, obviously, but it's helpful to have a term that describes the concept. So you've put this together. And what I want to spend the bulk of our time talking about today is some of the content from your book, Market Street Pastor Ministry Sustainability Without Money Stress. And the subtitle of your book, I think, is really the essence of what we want to talk about. And it actually helps people understand right away what it is that you're about. You're not about, hey, pastors banking more money. Let's see how much cash we can get in. The
Right.
ministry doesn't pay us enough. So if we really want to, live luxuriously, we got to have the second job. You're talking about sustainable ministry and reduction of financial stress. And those are two things that I think every single pastor on the face of the earth ought to have as tools in their tool belt. We need to have sustainable ministry, and we don't want to be stressing over the finances. So if there's a way that I can gain one and lose the other, that's what I want. And you walk through so much in here that's very, very practical. So I want to jump right into the book, and I'm just going to probably just throw quotes and ideas at you from your own book and then get your further comment on it, if that sounds like a good way to go forward. You start straight off the top. I think it's just page 2. You made a statement, and it was one of the first things that caught me when I read the book and went, okay, I like where he's going here. Quote, if the pastor relies fully on the church to fund life and ministry, it's a question. Does that put the pastor's family, career, and community in jeopardy? So I'm going to ask you your question. If the pastor is relying fully on the church to fund life and ministry, is it actually putting those things in jeopardy? And if so, why?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for reading the book. I really appreciate it. Not every, sometimes I go on a podcast and it's like, so you wrote this book, tell us about it. It's like, well, okay. But yes.
Yeah.
So the opening story that I share in the book is when I moved from kind of a medium-sized church to a much larger church as a youth pastor and ended up being terminated shortly thereafter. And really my wife and I was only the two of us at that point. We did not have children, and recognizing pretty quickly, like, wow, like churches are really fickle in terms of places of employment. So if you work a traditional kind of corporate marketplace job, extremely unlikely that you're going to get terminated over a disagreement with your boss or a senior leader. It would take something unethical or illegal to have that hammer be dropped. Yet churches don't always have those policies in place. Granted, I know there's some folks who could maybe come from the mainline tradition where there's a little bit more safety mechanisms, but I'm speaking really to that independent, autonomous, kind of evangelical adjacent church leader where yeah, you show up to a place and you say, "Hey, I'm here. My family is here. We're here to do ministry." And unfortunately, you make the wrong board member or the wrong senior pastor or the wrong big giver, like
Mm-hmm.
upset with something you say or do, that could put your job in jeopardy. And unfortunately, I get phone calls every week of pastors who say I was here and I something happened and I no longer am employed. I was terminated immediately and maybe given a 2 week severance or a 4 week severance, and I don't know what I'm going to do next. So to answer my own question, I would say that churches, I love them. It's the bride of Christ. It's the church is how we're going to reach the nations. And in terms of churches as a place of employment, they can unfortunately be very fickle.
Yeah, it reminds me when I was early on in ministry, and I got a full generation in age on you. So we're talking, in a year that began with the numbers 19, not 20. Back then, when I was fairly early in ministry and fairly early at the church that we still serve, we were doing some new kind of different fun crazy things to see what we could see what would work because the church had been
Right.
through some real crises. And I was talking with one of my denominational leaders and he was asking, how's it going there? And I said, well, we're trying some new things, kind of crazy. Some of it's working, some of it's not. And he's like, how are the people accepting those ideas? Like, I said, well, so far they like the stuff that works. They don't like the stuff that doesn't work, but they're willing to, give it a try. And he goes, wow, he says, that's really rare. He says, most of the pastors I know who are trying new things, they get real pushback, especially from the seniors. And he said, they got to stop doing it because as we know, the seniors are the ones that pay the bills.
Mm,
And I went, first of all, one, how sad that that's the case, that they see the seniors as the enemy in moving forward.
right. Right.
And secondly, that's the criterion for whether or not you're going to try to follow the Lord's leading or at least experiment with things to begin to discover the Lord's leading. But no,
Mm,
not if it's going to upset the people who pay the bills. So, yeah, we've got to be able to move forward in ministry. I made the decision back at around that time that I'm going to do what I believe the Lord is calling me to do in ministry with, wise counsel from the people who are a part of that ministry in the church. And after that, we'll figure out how to do the finances of it. But that's a lot easier to do when you've got a financial base that isn't dependent on whether or not people are happy with the decisions you make as a pastor. So let's walk through some of that process. You say that the first step we need to take is a change of our mindset. So, what is the change of mindset and why do we need to make it?
Yeah, so that's the opening chapter, and I find that is often the biggest hurdle for pastors who are looking to make this switch. Unfortunately, as you well know, Carl, we live in a society and here in the West and in 2024 America where there's still a stigma of covocational, bivocational pastors. It's you're not a quote unquote real pastor, or you couldn't quite hack it as a full timer, or our church is failing because our pastor has a second source of income beyond the tithes and offerings. There's all those things kind of looming in our brain. So the reason I talk about the mindset shift is because if you're making the decision, I'm going to transition from a full timer to a part-time pastor, tent making pastor, covo pastor, whatever you want to call it, and you're saying, well, this is because I'm a failure, or because everything fell apart, or because I'm not doing what God called me to do. Therefore, this is Plan B. That's going to demonstrate in how you present yourself in interviews. That's going to demonstrate in how you present yourself in your resume. That's going to show up in every area and every facet of how you're presenting yourself to position yourself for the marketplace. So you have to kind of change your mindset that says, no, I'm not a failure. I'm kind of like the tagline of the book says, I'm finding a way to sustain my ministry long term. I would not call that person a failure. I would say the failure is the person that says, well, heck with it. I'll go do something different and forget ministry, forget the church. But if you're listening to this and you're a pastor that says, I see the numbers and I sort of see the writing on the wall, and I want to lead into the future by pursuing this path, that's not a failure in my view. That's a hero.
Yeah, I fully agree. As you're saying that, it reminds me that there's a real correlation between your ministry and our ministry here. The second sentence of my first book, The Grasshopper Myth, was, I am a small church pastor and I'm not a failure.
Mm,
And we could absolutely do the same thing. I am a co-vocational pastor and I am not a failure. We're not
right.
doing it because we failed at doing something else.
Right.
But there's an intentionality behind this. There's a strategy behind this that really matters. And I know this is not just in pastoral ministry. This is true in the general marketplace. There was a really short season of time if you're talking about world history, there was a very short season of time for just a couple of generations in the 20th century, in the 1900s, where the idea of one parent going to work 9 to 5 was enough to pay the bills for a family of four and nobody else had to work and everything was okay. If you're on a farm, that was never the case, right? But there was a sliver of time for a sliver of people, but we somehow made that the standard for everybody everywhere at all times. But during that season where dad typically went to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, earned enough money for a family of four, that was also when the full-time pastor of even a small church of sometimes even 40 or 50 people, they could be paid enough by that 40 or 50 congregants to be able to full-time pastor. But we think that has been that way for 2,000 years, and it really wasn't. It was a very small sliver of history in a very specific geographical location.
Hmm.
within America, and not just in America, but only in certain spots in America. But again, we've standardized that. Today, however, there's nobody entering the marketplace today, secular or church, and going, I expect to get a job that I will keep until I retire, and that will be enough money to pay for my entire family. Nobody is entering the marketplace that right now. So why should we, as pastors, be any exception? So I think that makes it easier for that mindset shift because we're not the only ones making it. That's the way the culture is now.
Yeah, you're spot on. And one of the early, impetus for IHOP pastors to get jobs was having the opportunity to kind of go from small town America, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, where every pastor I knew was full time, to the urban environment and black churches in Harlem and Spanish speaking churches in the Bronx. All those pastors were bivocational or covocational.
Mm.
A lot of them worked for the school district, a lot of them worked for the city, and they found ways to make it work. I think about our rural brothers and sisters who are serving churches. Almost all of them are bivocational, covocational. So you're spot on, brother. I think we've taken this kind of suburban model of church and life, and we kind of said that's normal for all of us, and that's how it's been for 2,000 years. But you're spot on. It was a small sliver for a small time. Things are getting more expensive. They're not getting cheaper. You factor in housing. You factor in. I joked around the other day with someone. I went to the grocery store with my kids for a quick trip, and the quick trip was $90. Like, when did a quick trip to the
Mhm.
grocery store cost $90? It used to be $30.
Oh yeah. Oh no. I'm fully, and we're all experiencing the same thing. So I think that when we look around and go, this is a cultural shift and not the failure of the church shift. I think that's a
Yeah.
big part of it for a lot of us. You talk about how, and this is something that I want to get to some of the practical steps towards this. And one of the things I think is important to establish up front for a lot of pastors is I think most pastors don't understand that they have skills that they have developed in pastoring that are incredibly valuable in the general job market. So walk us through some of that just to help us understand. We think, all I do is, I study and I preach and I run a church. How in the world can that be valuable out there in the corporate world? Well, it is. Walk us through some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I coach and advise pastors on is that we as pastors, we are generalists. We are okay at a lot of things. My joke is I say we're yellow belts in 100 things. And it's true. If you think about it, like you said, we're preaching, we're leading a board, maybe we're raising money, doing some project management, managing the budget with our team, with our staff, recruiting volunteers, hiring people. I mean, the list goes on and on. We've done all of those things as ministry professionals and as pastors. The challenge of it is that because we can do a lot of things okay, we're not quite sure what's the one or two things that I do really well. And I can say with confidence, like, this is something that this is my sweet spot, as it were. So I kind of go through a process in the book. I call it the heart, the head, the hands, the feet framework. So essentially, what I ask the reader, and I ask those listening at home, is like, if you think about your time in ministry, what were the things that you did that really gave you life? Because I don't want someone to go get a job that they're going to hate 40 hours a week and then try to pastor a church. That's not my goal here. I want you to be in a role where you're thriving and you're using your gifts to God's glory and to your family's benefit. So the first thing I talk about is the heart. That's kind of the not-for-profit work. So if you're someone who's really oriented by compassion, serving others, that's a really easy branch to swing to for a pastor, because churches are nonprofits in this country, and a lot of people who work in nonprofits are believers or people of faith. So you should orient your job search around heart-oriented professions, nonprofits. If you go up to the head, if you're very cerebral, academic, you like reading, you like researching, you like studying, you like teaching, you should explore a role in learning and development, which is what I pursued as a co-vocational pastor. So that's training, coaching, developing programs that help people grow in their leadership. Going down to your hands, that's juggling multiple things at once, managing projects, programs, people. That's a career in project management. I've seen a lot of pastors really hone in on those skills and sell them to hiring managers and get great jobs in the project management field. And then going down to your feet, if you're kind of active, you like moving around, you like calling people, going out for coffees, meeting with people, hearing their stories, you should consider pursuing a career in sales. And sometimes pastors hear sales and I think, ew, that's kind of icky. I've never done sales. It's like, well, when you ask folks to volunteer for the VBS, I mean, what are you doing? You're not selling a physical product or service, but you're selling an idea. Like, your life will be
Mhm.
enriched by serving our children at this VBS. So those are sort of the four paths that I recommend pastors to consider as they start the job search.
Yeah, it's really, really helpful. That was a quick, good overview of it. But I really encourage people to pick up the book, Market Street Pastor, and get an understanding of those four things in detail. And Eric also lists a whole bunch of career types that you can pursue given your current pastoral skill sets that are really, really helpful to look at. So if you're really considering this, I encourage you to do this because it's not just about, hey, you can do this. There is some of that in the book, but it's really more practical steps. And very practical steps. How do I take this one at a time to get there? In fact, I want to go over some of those practical steps in a little bit with you. And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do to help us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Secondly, consider becoming a financial partner on an ongoing or one-time basis. Just go to karlvaters.com/support, where you can give through Zelle, Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon using your bank account, credit, or debit card. This will help us as we continue to put these resources into the hands of the people who need them the most. Continuing through the book, though, you ask another question. Let me pose it to you. If God has called you to ministry, you ask, does that mean that God has only called you to receive your compensation from the church? Now, years ago, I would have answered that question unequivocally yes. Uh-huh. If God has called me to ministry, he has called me to receive my compensation from the church, and I'm going to walk in faith and believe that if I commit myself full-time to the church, God will meet all of my needs. And now you're asking a rhetorical question that sounds really unspiritual, Eric. So I no longer respond that way, but how would you respond to people who answer the question the way I would have, which is, yeah, if God has called me to full-time ministry, God has called me to full-time compensation only from the church.
Yeah, well, I think I would probably answer the question by question. I know, very, very pastoral, but I guess I would ask the question back to someone who really has that conviction. Does that mean that the people that are in your pews who work a traditional job, that they're not called to ministry? Because I think we all, as believers, whether we're full-time in the church or whether we're full-time at the hair salon cutting hair, or the mechanic changing tires and doing all the things that mechanics do. I'm not a big car guy, so that was a bad example, but you know what I mean. Like, that person, the hairdresser and the mechanic, are also called to their own ministry. Yeah, they're not 40 plus hours a week in the church pastoring, preaching, counseling, shepherding people, but they're able to minister to folks in those environments. And in some ways, they might have more opportunities to minister to people than you as a pastor could ever even imagine, because they're in proximity with people who are not believers or who have questions on faith that might not wander into a church, but they'll wander into the hair salon and to the mechanic. So I think that's the first question I would ask. The second question I would probably ask is, well, like, where did you hear that? Like, let's pull on that string a little bit. Like, can you point to me somewhere in scripture? Did you hear it in a sermon? Did you have a mentor or a friend or someone you looked up to that told you this was the path? And the last thing I would say is we trust God to provide through the tithes and offerings of the church. Why would we not also say, well, God also provided for me to earn income through this job? It's one of the things that I, don't always share this, but I will, because this is the church lobby with Karl Vaters. But like, early on in my ministry, my wife was the breadwinner of our family. So I had no issue sending my wife to work at a hospital as an RN, while I earned probably 30% of our household income at that point, and she was making the lion's share of our earnings. And like, in my brain, that was okay, because in my brain, like you, Carl, it was, well, I'm called by God to do this, therefore he'll meet all my needs. Well, actually, your wife working at a hospital met all of your needs, right?
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. You're right. And I did that fairly early on as well. My wife worked a second job, and going back, she probably would have had to anyway, because my secondary wouldn't have done that. I'm not against both spouses working to be able to provide for the family, but you're right. I was sitting there thinking, okay, I'm honoring God by just doing this, and I was, but no, you're right. Why is it okay to rely on her secular job and not okay for me to have a secular job to pay the bill? No, that's a take I hadn't even thought about. I love that. Let's get into some real nuts and bolts practical. There are a bunch of things in here that people need to buy the book in order to get details on. But in chapter 3, you write about this nasty term, rebranding yourself. but you it's rebranding yourself without losing your soul. So I want to walk through the 7 steps just real quickly, just to get a quick overview of what that looks like. But before we get to the 7 steps, when you say rebranding, what is rebranding about? Because that is a word for a lot of people that are like, eh. I mean, even in my most recent book, I talk about chasing a brand as a problem, but it doesn't mean you can't use the term. So explain for us what that means and what it doesn't mean.
Yeah, yeah, it was one of those words that, I was going back and forth with my editor to keep it, not keep it, but they said just, keep it. I don't know what other word to use, but essentially it's
Yeah.
the idea of thinking of yourself beyond, yeah, I've been a pastor and that's all I know how to do. You or I can't walk into a marketplace job and sit down for an interview and say, so tell me about your professional background and talk about pastoral counseling, preaching a sermon, going to a hospital to pray for someone who's on their deathbed. I mean, these are all skills that you've gained, yet you have to kind of repackage them in a way that makes sense to the person on the other side of the table, assuming that they have no clue what a pastor is beyond what they've seen on TV and movies, which is never a good thing, by the way. So
Mhm.
when
Yeah.
I say rebrand, I don't say like I'm not saying to completely forget about your identity as a pastor. I'm saying like what are some of the ways that I can message these really amazing things that I've done in ministry in a way that makes sense to the person who has no clue what a pastor is and what a pastor does. And yeah, the book goes into more details of kind of how to break that down. But that's what I mean by rebrand. So it's not a
Yeah.
matter of like changing who you are. That's certainly not good for anybody, but it's a matter of messaging it in a way that makes sense. The way I talk to my 6 year old is different than the way I talk to my mother who's in her 60s, and that's okay. It's just how we communicate.
Yeah, yeah. How do you present yourself in an environment that most of us aren't used to presenting ourselves in, particularly? Yeah.
Precisely.
So let's walk through the 7 steps because they're very, very helpful. And obviously, in the book, you go into more detail, but it'll give people, I think, a sense of how specific, how granular you get in the book, and how helpful it is. So, step number 1, you talk about the elevator pitch.
Yep. So the elevator pitch is in 60 seconds or less, describe who you are and what you do. So kind of going back to that earlier comment I made, how we're yellow belts in 100 things. Once you start getting very clear on here's the thing that I can do really well, it's what I enjoy doing, I'm passionate about it, and I can make money about it. And that's how you're able to convince, a hiring manager or recruiter that you're the right person for the job, even as a career changer. So to give you an example, when I transitioned from full-time church ministry into the marketplace, I worked as a learning and development trainer for a for-profit company based out of London, big hub in New York. And I walked in there feeling like a total imposter. All I'd ever done is ministry. I have a bachelor's degree from Liberty and a seminary degree. And here's my colleagues. Some of them have worked for the New York Times and these other, big name companies. And then there's me, feeling like a fish out of water. But I think one of the things that I was able to angle in that space was that, hey, I'm really good at walking into a room full of strangers, kind of winning them over and convincing them to listen to me because I've done it for the last, at that point, 7 or 8 years as a pastor. And here's kind of what that would look like tangibly. That was a unique skill that I earned in ministry that, frankly, a lot of my colleagues in that room didn't have. They weren't used to being in
Mhm.
environments where you're, walking into a room of strangers or relative strangers and talking to them. But we as pastors, if we're guest speaking at another friend's church or we're leading a Bible study, whatever it is, a lot of reasons why we'd be in that environment. Doing a funeral for somebody in the community, you don't really know who they are, but being able to build rapport rapidly is a really unique skill that the marketplace would want. So that's like a really tangible
Yeah.
example. Saying like, what's your elevator pitch? What did you do uniquely, Eric? Hey, I can build rapport with strangers and without a problem at all. I can win them over. We can have a good conversation. I can help them grow. That makes sense to the person listening.
Yeah, the term elevator pitch has made its way into the common lingo, but if you haven't heard of it before, it's called the elevator pitch because it's something that can be done in an elevator ride. You find yourself in an elevator with an executive. How do you sell yourself to that executive during the elevator ride? That's why it's called that. But what I've discovered in the elevator pitch is, in addition to being a good way to understand how to describe what you do to others, it helps to clarify for you who you are and what you do.
Precisely.
So when I was beginning this ministry and I was trying to figure out how do I describe it to others, I had to work on the elevator pitch. And it was only when I was able to land on an elevator pitch that made sense that I was then able to clarify to myself, oh, here's what I do. I help small churches get healthy.
Mm-hmm.
But the amount of time it took me to get to those few words was ridiculous because there's so much other stuff in there. So the elevator pitch clarifies not just to them, but to you what it is that you have to offer. So step 1 is the elevator pitch. Step 2, format your resume to not look pretty.
Yes, I had too much fun writing this. So when it comes to making your resume not look pretty, the typical ministry resume is going to have kind of the family photo with all of you, in a field, smiling, looking happy. It's going to share all the
I've got
things
some
that
of
you.
those. Yeah.
Oh yeah, as do I, as do I. My wife and kids look great. I look kind of like, what's that guy doing there? But that's beside the point.
Mhm.
And you're kind of having very, very like robust ministry language. I led these small groups. I did this outreach. I went on this mission trip. The thing of it is kind of similar to the elevator pitch. What people don't always understand is that when you apply for a marketplace job, before your resume is read by a human, it's read by a machine called the applicant tracking system, which is essentially a robot that goes in and looks for keywords. So making sure that every word on that page or 2 pages, however long a resume might be, I don't recommend longer than 2 pages, has a purpose and a point for being there. And I do resume rewrites with I help pastors get jobs, and sometimes people get a little bit mad at me because they're like, "Why didn't you include the church plant I did in 1984?" And I say, "Well,
Right.
because that's not relevant to the job that you're applying for." So formatting your resume to not look pretty is the second step.
Yeah, it is strange. We're in an environment right now you have to sell yourself to the computer before you get a chance to talk to a person. And that's they're actually testing for stuff that has nothing to do with what you're eventually going to do, but it's part of the online system now where a job gets thousands of applicants, even for people who don't really want the job because they're just applying for everything. So you got to rise above the clutter, and that's part of what that does. So that's
Yes.
step two. Step three is build your power statements, and there's a bunch under this, but primarily it's under what not to do and what to do.
Yeah, so essentially a power statement is a fancy way of saying how do you quantify the volume of work that you managed. So if I was applying for, let's say, a small groups pastor job at a church, and I wrote in my bullet point in my resume, I worked at First Baptist Church, and while I was there, I led small groups. Well, okay, you led what? Three small groups, two small groups, 100 small groups. That means a lot of different things. Quantifying and qualifying, these the number of small groups, the number of maybe volunteer leaders I had, how often these groups met, and what were the outcomes of these groups meetings. So this is when it gets kind of corporate speak, but if you can say, hey, because of the small group ministry that I led in my church, we had higher retention, more people stayed engaged with our faith community. That's the sort of outcomes that they're going to look for. Because just saying I led small groups, well, okay, I don't even know what a small group is, let alone what it means to lead one as a secular hiring manager in the corporate environment.
Yeah, exactly. Step number four, edit your resume by here's something every single writer has heard at some point or another by drowning your darlings.
Yeah, sort of going back to that earlier point, if it doesn't serve the purpose of positioning you well for that job, does not deserve to be on that paper. One thing I didn't share earlier is after you get past that initial ATS software, when a human being looks at your resume, they'll spend about 7 seconds looking at it before they
Yeah.
decide if this is the person I want to talk to or is this going to go in the reject pile. So if you're packing in every single thing you've done since working at Wendy's in high school, like I did, immediately it's like, I'm overwhelmed with information. Let's put this in the reject pile.
Yeah. The first two steps we've got to realize is the first step or two is simply getting through the clutter.
Mhm.
You've got to be noticed. And so you've got to write it in a way of what they're looking for. And then for most of us, we can probably do much better if we can get in front of an actual person, but we've got to figure out how to get through the clutter to get in front of an actual person first. So those help with that, which leads to step number five, write thoughtful cover letters.
Yeah, so as a career changer, unfortunately, you're competing against people for that job who have done that job in the same industry, have done that job in a similar company, maybe have done that job for a competitor. So how do you position yourself to say, oh, let's bring this former pastor in for an interview when you're already looking at a different resume where this is someone who's done the exact same job or a similar job elsewhere? The cover letter is a strategic place. I think it's a good practice for pastors to even get into, like, how do I position myself in a way that someone says, huh, this is kind of compelling. I want to hear this person's story. I want them to come in for an interview.
Yeah, and you have some really good ideas on how to do that. There's really templates to follow to be able to do that well. Step six, network. Just don't be weird.
Uh, this is an important step that a lot of pastors miss. They think, let me get a nice resume, let me format it correctly, let me do all those things as I should, And then, of course, companies will just be crawling for me to come interview for them, and they'll offer me this amazing salary and this great, cushy work from home job. If only it were that easy, it most certainly is not. Like you said earlier, Carl, and you're spot on, a given job could have 100, 500, 2,000 applicants. So if you don't have an in with that hiring manager or with that recruiter, immediately you're already at a massive disadvantage. So I talk about in the book how to get onto LinkedIn, how to connect with people that are already working at that company. And what some pastors don't realize is that if you work for a company, Carl, that I'm interested in, if you and I have a 15-minute Zoom conversation about the job that I'm interested in, and you really realize, okay, Eric seems like a nice enough, normal guy, I'll submit his resume on his behalf. If I get hired, you get a bonus. So for you, it's like great. I just was able to make some pretty easy money, and for me, I was able to get a job. So the kind of the pray and spray model of job seeking, it feels like it's productive because you're sending out all these applications. I would recommend for pastors and all job seekers, be strategic about where you're applying and who you're networking with before you apply.
Yeah, it's been true for all of history that just as simply being in the room is quite often the most important step of getting something. The old stories of the Hollywood set where somebody got sick and they need somebody, and hey, you standing there watching, why don't you come in and step in? They become a star, and obviously that's overplayed. But now we do need to be in the room online. We need to
Yes.
be in these conversations so that people see us as a presence, so that there's an awareness of who we are, which leads to, and you mentioned it already, step 7, build a LinkedIn. I want to use this as bonus material because you walk through very specific steps of how to use LinkedIn for this. And like I've got a LinkedIn account. I'm not looking for a job, haven't been for a long time. I'm on there because there's something about its search engine and its how many times, for instance, have you looked for somebody online and the first thing that comes up is their LinkedIn profile and they haven't been on it in years, but somehow LinkedIn has this strength on search engines and they have a very specific place in the marketplace. So give us a real quick overview of why LinkedIn matters. And then on the bonus material, we'll walk through it a little bit more. And after he gives us the overview of that, I'll tell you how you can get the bonus material.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. That's a really good example. LinkedIn is sort of that digital meeting place for professionals to network and to get to know people. And the thing I really like about LinkedIn as opposed to some of the other social media platforms, like if someone adds me as a friend on Facebook and I don't know them, I'm not gonna accept that request because I just don't know who they are. But if someone who I don't know sends me a connection on LinkedIn and they put like a little thoughtful note, like, hey, Eric, I really admire your work. I'm interested in the company that you're at. Would you mind accepting my request? I likely would because I look at that as an opportunity to expand my network. So, in my view, LinkedIn used properly is like a secret weapon for job seekers.
Yeah. So hiring recruiters are on LinkedIn. That's Facebook is where friends hang out with friends. LinkedIn is where recruiters go to see who's looking for jobs and where people who are looking for jobs find recruiters. It's not the only place, but it really is the strongest one. So Eric walks through how to use LinkedIn well with a very clear step-by-step process. And we're going to do this in the bonus material. So if you want to receive the bonus material, here's how to get it. Go to karlvaters.com/support. If you become a monthly supporter, one of the many things you will get as a monthly supporter is you'll get the weekly newsletter, which has all of the links to all of the bonus material, including what I'm going to record with Eric. If you want to get just that material and not become a monthly supporter, you can do that as well for free. karlvaters.com/subscribe. That gets you the weekly newsletter with all of the links for all of the bonus material for everybody, including with Eric on how to build your LinkedIn. So we will do that. And it'll be a 5 to 10 minutes on YouTube on how to do that. But the only way you can do that is to get the special link that you get in the newsletter. So subscribe for that. Before we get to the lightning round, let's walk through a couple more things as we get now to the end of your book. In chapter 4, you talk about some really helpful steps about how to do a good interview once you get through all of that clutter and you actually get in front of an actual human being. So let me just ask you one question on this because people can go further in the book if they pick it up, if they pick up Market Street Pastor. What are some key mistakes that pastors tend to make once they get the face-to-face interview? Let's just go there.
Right. I think the first and most obvious mistake that pastors make, and I made it myself, so I'll pick on me before I pick on anyone listening, is they rest on their charisma and not their competence. So in
Mm.
ministry environments, for better or worse, if you are a likable guy, likable gal, you're funny, you're charming, you're, able to speak well, some ministry environments like that's enough to get you moved forward in a process. Just your charisma alone. in the marketplace, because hiring is all about risk, the question they're not asking themselves while they're talking to you is, do I like this person? They're asking themselves, can this person execute on the duties of the job? So obviously, be likable, of course. Why would you not? But at the same time, really articulating to them why you're able to execute is what the goal is for that interview. If they invite you for the interview, they've already think that you might have something to offer. All you wanted to do in that interview process is prove to them that they are right.
Yeah, yeah, and a whole lot of more information in the book about that. The last chapter is on sustainability. And you use this sentence, which I think is so important. It's one reason why, if you get the book Market Street Pastor, read all the way to the end, because it's not one of these things where just kind of, sometimes we read books and the last chapter or two is just like, well, this is the least important stuff, and that's why it went at the end. That's not the case with this book. And let me give this quote back to you from page 105. If you do everything in this book and then keep attempting to pastor like you have as a full-timer, you will crash and burn within 6 months. I guarantee it. So why is that the case? And how do we make sure that we don't have that happen to us?
Yeah, so I think you asked an earlier question, like what is a covocational pastor? And I kind of answered, well, it's someone who has a ministry in the marketplace and the church. And if I ever write a second book, which I don't know if I will, but if I do, I'd probably write a book called The Covocational Church. Because it's not just a shift for you as a
Mm,
pastor, it's a shift for the whole congregation. It's a shift that says, hey, our pastor is now, doing something else besides pastoring this congregation. Therefore, we need to all pitch in above and beyond maybe what we have traditionally. I think if there's one warning label, a big red warning label I could put on the book, it would say like, do not proceed with status as quo if you implement these ideas, because that is an appetite for a long-term loss. You'd have to figure out, hey, what are those tough conversations I need to have with people? Who are the folks that can kind of move into more leadership, operating as God has called them to, that can support me in this journey? Because if I just keep trying to maintain the dynamic of solo pastor who does everything with a job thrown into the mix, it is, no matter how high functioning you think you might be, you will burn out.
yeah, no, that is hugely important. Again, with the subtitle of the book, Ministry Sustainability Without Money Stress, getting that marketplace job can reduce your money stress, but it will decrease your ministry sustainability if
Right.
you don't make the proper adaptations for that. We want to do both things at the same time. So,
Mhm.
but let's get to the lightning round. So many good things in this, but I want to get you through the 4 questions that everybody else has to face as well. So you're going to have to go through the gauntlet to lightning round. Question number 1. What are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to them?
Oh man, the biggest change that I've seen in my field of ministry and how I've adapted to it. I was just having this conversation with someone earlier today, and I sense from my earlier days in ministry that if you had a highly produced and slick service, that was enough to attract not only, believers, but even non-believers. A high production value, a well-developed sermon, very much like a Broadway show on a Sunday morning, that would bring the masses. I think in 2024, and I even began noticing this earlier, people didn't really crave that. They crave authenticity and realness and rawness. If they wanted a show, they go see a show. You can't compete with Lord of the Rings, and neither can I. So I think what I've had to adapt is that people aren't looking for perfection. They're not looking for slick. They're not looking for this perfect package, church experience. They're looking for real. They're looking for authentic, and that's a welcome change that I think our churches are overdue for.
Agreed. Yeah, and it's very good news. We just have to make the shift. Yep.
Mhm.
Secondly, what free resource, like an app or a website, has helped you lately that you would recommend for small church ministry?
Yeah, I recommend I do the daily examine app on my phone. Time that I spend in the evening looking back on the day, reflecting on the ways in which I've seen God work. You can do it in 5 or 10 minutes. I wish I could say I do it every day, but I'm not that disciplined. But the days I do it, I sleep much better that night. So I recommend the daily examine prayer app, which is available at least on iPhone. I can't speak for Android, but I'm assuming it is.
Okay, we'll put that in the show notes as well. And I assume examen is EXAMEN,
You got it.
right?
Yep.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Third, what's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
Man, oh man, this is the gauntlet. Wow. I think the best piece of ministry advice I'd ever received is that no matter what you do in your ministry, nothing will make God love you any more or any less. Yeah, that's how I would
Yeah.
answer that.
Yeah, that's pretty good. All right. What's the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
Oh man, we had an outreach event and a woman who had some challenges handed me a letter. I never met her before, never saw her before, and handed me a letter that God told her that I should become her husband and like run off with her and have a happy life together. And I'm like, I'm gonna just take this and ask you to please leave. That was probably the weirdest.
Yeah,
That's
that's
up
right
there.
up there. Alrighty. Yeah. Hey, if anybody wants to reach out to you for anything, what's the best way for them to find you and reach out to you?
Yeah, the website is ihelppastorsgetjobs.com. You can download a free PDF that'll put you on my mailing list, and that'll give you my email as well. I'm also on formerly known as Twitter X, to your point
Hmm.
earlier, just my name, Eric Hoke, and I'm most active on there of all the social medias.
Terrific. Again, the book is Market Street Pastor, Ministry Sustainability Without Money Stress. I highly recommend the book. I've got it underlined and tagged all over the place. And we are going to go from here into bonus material. And we're on the bonus material. We're going to talk about the steps to build your LinkedIn. So if you are really seriously considering doing covocationality to reduce money stress and to have long-term ministry sustainability, you can get that by going to karlvaters.com/support, become a monthly supporter. And one of the bonuses you'll receive is the weekly newsletter, or you can get the weekly newsletter for free. Go to karlvaters.com/subscribe, and that will get you that bonus material as well. Then you'll be able to follow along with us on the steps to build your LinkedIn. Eric, thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you for the pastors that you're helping, and thank you for the strength that you bring to the church. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Carl. It was my honor.
Well, if you've made it all this way into the podcast, you're taking covocational ministry seriously, and I say good for you. One of the things that I keep coming back to since recording this interview is how the current shifts in the secular marketplace are forcing us in the church to rethink ministry in ways that are actually closer to the New Testament model. Specifically, regarding the closing point that Eric made about forcing us to rethink not just how the pastor invests their ministry time, but how the church body needs to rethink how they see the role of the pastor. This is a huge point that I made in De-sizing the church, that we need to get better at discipling our people so that they're called to ministry and not just to rely on the pastor to do ministry. If covocationality can nudge the church toward greater cooperative leadership through training and discipleship, that will be a huge blessing, not just for individual pastors and congregations, but for the church as a whole. So, even if you're not yet ready to become covocational, start laying the groundwork through practical discipleship. You will never regret it. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.